There is a test I applied to every decision I ever made about what to build. One question: does this make the life of an ordinary working man concretely better? Not impressively better, not spectacularly better in a way that gets written about in newspapers, concretely better. Does it change the specific texture of his daily life in a way that he can feel when he wakes up in the morning and begins his day? The automobile passed that test. The $5 workday passed that test. The moving assembly line passed that test, because it was not impressive to watch, but it was transformative to experience. In the age I lived through, I watched many men build impressive things, demonstrations of engineering that stopped crowds, machines that did things no machine had done before, feats that made the watching world say the word impossible and then stop saying it. Some of those builders became very wealthy and very celebrated, and most of what they built is now gone, or irrelevant, or a footnote in a history that nobody reads anymore. What I built is still running, not because I was smarter or luckier, because I was building for a different target. I was building for the nation, and building for a nation is a completely different activity from building for an audience. Stay with me, because the difference between those two kinds of building is the most important practical thing I know about how to create something that actually lasts. I am Henry Ford. I built the Ford Motor Company from a workshop behind my house. I built the Model T, which put ordinary working families on wheels for the first time in history. I built the assembly line, which changed how the entire world makes things. I paid my workers $5 a day when $2.30 was the standard, and I did it not as charity but as business logic that the rest of the industry took years to understand. I built River Rouge, which was at the time the largest integrated manufacturing complex on Earth. I did not build these things because I was trying to impress anyone. I built them because ordinary people needed them, and no one else was building them for ordinary people. There have been in every era men who build for crowds and men who build for people. The distinction sounds subtle. It is not. A man who builds for crowds is asking one question at the core of every decision: how does this look? A man who builds for people is asking a different question: how does this work for the person who needs it? Both can produce impressive results. Only one produces infrastructure, and infrastructure is what nations are made of. Listen to this every day, because what I am going to describe to you about the difference between building for crowds and building for nations is something that will change how you look at every significant decision you make about what to do with your time, your money, and your capability. The man who hears this once understands a framework. The man who hears this 30 times starts building differently. The first thing I want you to understand is the specific way that crowd building seduces talented people away from nation building. It is not obvious while it is happening. It feels like ambition. It feels like vision. It has the texture of boldness and the appearance of courage. But underneath it, if you press on it, is something different. It is the desire to be seen building rather than the desire to build something that serves. When I began working on what would become the Model T, the fashionable thing in the automobile world was to build for the wealthy. Speed records, elegant designs, handcrafted vehicles that demonstrated extraordinary craftsmanship and sold to men who had the money to spend on extraordinary craftsmanship. These were the vehicles that won races and got written about in newspapers and attracted the attention of engineers and inventors who wanted to be associated with excellence. They were genuinely excellent. They were also irrelevant to most of the population of the United States. I did not want to build something excellent for the few. I wanted to build something good enough and cheap enough and durable enough that the farmer in the field and the worker in the city could own one, maintain it himself, and use it to move through his life with a freedom he had never had before. This was not exciting to the engineering community. It was not exciting to investors. It was not the kind of vision that produced admiring coverage in the publications of the day. It was boring in its specification. A vehicle for everyone, simple, durable, affordable, repairable by the man who owned it using tools he already had. This sounded to most sophisticated observers like building less rather than building more. But here is the thing I understood that the crowd builders did not. When you build for everyone, The compounding effect of scale is incomprehensible from the position of someone building for the few. A vehicle that 1,000 wealthy men own affects 1,000 lives. A vehicle that 1 million ordinary families own affects 5 million lives and creates an economy of roads, fuel, repair, insurance, parts supply, and related industries that produces a transformation of national life that no amount of excellence in the 1,000 vehicle category could approach. The automobile did not change America because it was excellent. It changed America because it was everywhere. And it was everywhere because I chose to build for everyone rather than for the audience that would have been most impressed by what I built. There was a man I knew in the years when I was developing the Model T who represented the alternative path with complete clarity. His name was George, and he was a genuinely gifted engineer, more technically sophisticated in several respects than I was. George built racing automobiles, beautiful machines. Fast beyond anything else on the road, he was celebrated in the circles where automobile enthusiasts gathered and admired by every serious engineer who examined his work. He won competitions. He set records. He produced vehicles that were undeniably extraordinary. George spent his working life doing this and died having produced nothing that any ordinary person ever owned or used. His vehicles existed in a world of wealthy enthusiasts, competition events, and the admiration of people who understood the engineering sufficiently to appreciate it. When he died, his company closed. His designs were studied by historians of early automotive engineering. His name survived in footnotes. I am not saying George's life was wasted. The technical work was real, and some of what he discovered fed into vehicles that ordinary people eventually drove. But the specific choice he made, to build for the audience that would most admire the building, meant that the scope of what he built was permanently limited to the size of that audience. And audiences are always smaller than nations. The crowd-building trap is seductive precisely because crowds respond. They applaud. They write about what you have done. They give you the feeling of having produced something significant because the feeling of significance comes from the response of an audience, and audiences are expressive and immediate. The farmer whose life was changed by being able to drive to town instead of riding for 3 hours on a horse does not write about it. He does not gather with others to celebrate the man who made it possible. He simply uses the thing and lives differently as a result. Nation building produces results that are largely invisible to the builder while they are happening. Crowd building produces results that are visible and applauded immediately. This is why talented people drift toward crowd building even when they understand intellectually that nation building is more significant. The exercise I want you to do after listening to this is to write down the most significant thing you are currently building or working toward. Then, ask 2 questions. The first, who specifically benefits from this when it works? Name them, not a category. Specific people with specific lives that are specifically improved. The second, how large is that group? Is it growing or shrinking as the building advances? Nation builders discover, when they answer these honestly, that the group of people who benefit from what they are building is expanding with every decision they make. The crowd gets larger as the building gets more effective. Crowd builders discover the opposite. The more sophisticated and impressive the thing becomes, the more specialized the audience that can appreciate it, and the smaller the group of people whose lives are concretely changed by it. This test does not tell you what to build. It tells you whether what you are building is pointed toward the nation or toward the crowd, and that is information you need before you spend the next decade of your working life. Now I want to talk about the specific thing that separates nation building from crowd building at the level of daily decisions. Because the distinction is not only about the original vision, it is about the 10,000 decisions that happen after the vision and how those decisions are made by builders who are pointed in different directions. A crowd builder makes decisions based on what will produce the most impressive result in the shortest time. Impressive is the measurement, because impressive is what the crowd responds to. Speed is the constraint, because the crowd's attention is not infinite and must be captured while it is available. This produces a specific decision-making pattern. Choose the technology that is most advanced rather than the technology that is most durable. Build at the frontier where the engineering is difficult and the achievement is visible, rather than in the middle ground where the engineering is known and the achievement is invisible. Design for the demonstration rather than for the 10-year experience of the person who uses it every day. A nation builder makes decisions based on what will produce the most useful result at the largest scale. Useful is the measurement because useful is what makes lives concretely better. Scale is the constraint because serving a nation requires reaching everyone, not just the people who can access the most advanced version of the thing. This produces a different decision-making pattern. Choose the technology that is most reliable rather than most advanced. Build where the engineering is understood well enough to produce consistent results at low cost rather than at the frontier where every unit is a prototype. Design for the person who has never encountered this before, not for the person who will appreciate its sophistication. When I designed the Model T, I made a decision that the engineers around me found frustrating and the automotive community found incomprehensible. I decided that the Model T would be available in one color, black. Not because black was the most attractive color for an automobile, because black paint dried fastest, which meant it spent less time in the factory and could be produced at lower cost. It was not impressive. It was optimal for the person who needed a vehicle they could afford rather than a vehicle that expressed their personal taste. This single decision was a nation-building decision. Every expert who heard it thought about what it communicated to the audience of automobile enthusiasts and found it lacking. I thought about what it meant for the farmer who needed an affordable vehicle and found it correct. Two different measurements, two completely different conclusions from the same information. I want to describe a moment from the development of the assembly line that has stayed with me because it captures the distinction between building for spectacle and building for function in the most concrete way I know. In the years when we were developing what became the moving assembly line at Highland Park, there was a visitor who came to observe the work in progress. He was a journalist, well regarded in the publications that covered industrial and engineering topics. He had come expecting to see something impressive, something dramatic, some piece of engineering that would make an arresting story about the future of manufacturing. What he saw was men performing the same simple task repeatedly as partially assembled automobiles moved past them on a line. There was nothing visually arresting about it, no single moment of engineering genius made visible, no dramatic demonstration of capability. Just repetitive work, organized with extreme precision, moving at a pace that was calibrated to eliminate wasted motion without demanding more than men could sustain across a full working day. The journalist wrote a piece that described what he had seen with something approaching disappointment. He had expected to see the future and had seen something that looked like very organized, repetitive labor. He missed the story entirely, because the story was not in what the assembly line looked like. The story was in what it produced. The cost of building a Model T fell dramatically as the assembly line reached full operation. The fall in cost reached the buyer as a fall in price. The fall in price reached more buyers. More buyers meant more production. More production meant more learning about how to reduce cost further. The cycle compounded in a direction that changed American life over the following decade in ways that no impressive demonstration of engineering in a factory could have approached. The journalist was looking for spectacle. He was looking for a moment that would photograph well and read dramatically. What was happening in that factory was neither dramatic nor photogenic. It was the quiet, organized, systematic reduction of cost and time in a process that affected everything produced downstream. It was nation building. It looked, from the outside, like nothing much. Listen to this every night before you sleep. The part of it that connects to what you are currently building will be clearer each time. I want to address something directly that I have observed about the difference between men who build for nations and men who build for audiences, because it is relevant to every practical decision you are making right now about your own work. Nation building requires a specific tolerance for being misunderstood that crowd building does not. When you build for a crowd, the crowd tells you immediately whether what you have produced is valued. The response is fast and expressive and hard to miss. You know where you stand at all times because the crowd's reaction is your feedback signal. This is comfortable even when the reaction is negative. because negative feedback from a crowd is still attention, and attention is what crowd building runs on. When you build for a nation, the feedback is slow, statistical, and largely invisible to you while you are doing the work. You know the product is working when it reaches people who had never expected to reach it. You know the infrastructure is effective when it enables things that would not otherwise have been possible, quietly, without anyone attributing the enablement to your specific contribution. You know the system is succeeding when it runs without you, when other people use it to build things you had not imagined, when the thing you built becomes the foundation for things you will never see. This is the most important result a nation builder can produce, and it is also the result that produces the least recognition while it is happening. Carnegie understood this. He told me once at dinner that the man who builds the road gets less credit than the man who drives most quickly on it. That the audience sees the race, not the surface that makes the race possible. He was describing the specific invisibility of infrastructure, which is the primary output of nation building. Infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. When it works, it disappears into the background of life, as though it had always been there, and required no one's effort or genius to create. I built roads, in the metaphorical sense, not literal roads, though the automobile created the demand that eventually produced the national road system. I built the infrastructure of mobility, the infrastructure of affordable production, the infrastructure of the middle-class wage that gave working people the purchasing power to participate in the economy as buyers rather than only as producers. None of this was visible in the way that a spectacular engineering demonstration is visible. All of it was transformative in ways that a spectacular engineering demonstration cannot approach. The practical application of this for your own work is the following. When you are making a decision about where to direct your effort and your resources, ask yourself whether you are drawn toward the option because it will produce a more visible result or because it will produce a more useful one. These are often different options. The visible result gets faster feedback and more recognition. The useful result changes more lives and compounds into more significant outcomes. The crowd builder in you will always prefer the visible. The nation builder in you, if you can develop and sustain it, will learn to prefer the useful even when it is invisible. This discipline, the discipline of choosing useful over visible, is the hardest part of nation building. It requires that you sustain your conviction about the direction of your work through periods when the feedback is slow or absent, and the crowd builders around you are receiving the attention that visible results produce. It requires that you measure your progress by the quiet metric of how many people's lives are concretely better, rather than by the loud metric of how many people are impressed by what you have done. I did not always manage this perfectly. There were periods, particularly in the years of the company's greatest public success, when I made decisions that were more crowd-facing than nation-building in character. Decisions about how the company presented itself. Decisions about which aspects of the work to emphasize in public communication. I am not claiming to have been perfectly disciplined in the distinction I am describing. I am claiming that the most important things I built, the things that genuinely changed national life, were built in the periods when I was most clearly pointed at the useful rather than the visible, and the decisions I most regret were made in the periods when I had drifted toward the visible. The second exercise I want to give you is this. Look at the last 5 major decisions you made about your work or your resources. For each one, write honestly whether the primary attraction of the option you chose was its visibility or its usefulness, not what you told yourself at the time. What was actually driving the decision when you were most honest with yourself about it? Most people find, when they do this honestly, that a significant portion of their most energetic work is aimed at the visible version of their goals rather than the useful version. This is not a character failure. It is the default mode of a human being operating in a social world where visible results produce social rewards. The nation-building discipline is the practice of overriding that default, deliberately and consistently, in favor of the useful. One more thing before I close, and it is the thing I most want you to carry with you after this message is finished. The test of whether you built for a nation or built for an audience is not visible while you are building. It becomes visible over time. The crowd builder's work peaks at the moment of maximum attention and then diminishes as attention moves elsewhere. The nation builder's work compounds as the infrastructure it created enables more and more things that the builder never specifically designed. The test of nation building is what happens after the builder stops. Does the thing continue to serve? Does it expand? Does it enable others to build on top of it in ways the original builder did not foresee? Does it become more useful over time as more people learn how to use it? The things I built are still running, not because I designed them to outlast me in some deliberate way, because I built them to serve ordinary people, and ordinary people do not stop needing to be served when the builder stops being present. The need persists. The infrastructure that serves the need persists with it. And as new generations encounter the infrastructure, they find it useful and use it, not because they know who built it, or because they have any particular loyalty to the builder, but because it works. This is the ultimate measure of nation building. Not that people remember your name, not that they write about what you accomplished, but that the thing you built continues to be useful to people who have never heard of you and who would not care if they had. That the infrastructure you created is so embedded in the fabric of ordinary life that it is invisible, which is the only state infrastructure can achieve when it is truly serving its purpose. Build for that invisibility. Build for the moment when the thing you built disappears into the background of life because it works so well that no one needs to notice it. Build for the farmer who drives to town without thinking about the engineering that made the vehicle possible. Build for the worker whose wage allows him to buy the things his family needs without being conscious of the economic logic that produced that wage. Build for the nation that moves on what you built without remembering who built the road. That is what I built. That is what every serious builder in every era has built when they built something that lasted. The crowd gets the spectacle, the nation gets the road. Build the road. Listen to this tomorrow. The part of it that is most relevant to what you are currently doing will be clearer in the morning than it is tonight. What I am about to describe is the part of this that most people who think about building have never examined. It is the relationship between the size of your ambition and the breadth of the people it serves. Because these two things are often assumed to move together, and they do not. A man can have enormous ambition that serves a very narrow group, and a man can have modest-sounding ambition that transforms the lives of millions. The confusion between ambition and breadth of service is one of the most consistent errors I observed in the men who wanted to build significant things, but ended up building impressive ones. The ambitious men who built for narrow audiences were not small in their thinking. In most cases, they were larger in their thinking than the men who built for wide audiences. The engineering they pursued was more difficult. The science they engaged with was more advanced. The claims they made about what was possible were more dramatic. But dramatic claims about what is possible are not the same as changed lives for ordinary people. And it is changed lives, multiplied across the number of ordinary people whose lives you can reach, that constitutes the actual measure of what you built. I knew a man named Thomas, not Edison, a different Thomas, who built machinery in the years when I was developing the production methods at Highland Park. Thomas was brilliant in ways that I genuinely respected. He understood mechanical systems at a level of depth that most engineers I worked with did not reach. His designs were sophisticated and elegant, and the sophisticated and elegant people who encountered them immediately recognized their quality. Thomas spent nearly a decade developing a piece of machinery that would have reduced the cost of a specific industrial process by a meaningful amount. The work was genuine, and the potential was real. But the machinery he was developing required a level of technical expertise to operate that only a small number of industrial operations possessed. It was designed for excellence rather than for the operator who had no prior expertise in the process. And when it was finally ready and went to market, the buyers were the sophisticated operations that had been following its development and were equipped to use it. The operations that most needed the cost reduction, the smaller and less sophisticated ones, could not use it because they lacked the technical expertise the machinery assumed. Thomas had built for the technically sophisticated audience rather than for the operator with the real need, not from selfishness. From the very natural tendency of a sophisticated engineer to design for the level of understanding he himself possessed, he designed something he would have wanted to use. And what he would have wanted to use was not what the person who most needed it could actually use. This is the specific design failure of crowd building that even sincere and talented men fall into. You build what you yourself would find impressive rather than what the person who needs it most can actually use. You optimize for the response of the sophisticated observer rather than for the experience of the ordinary user. And the gap between those two targets, between the observer who understands and the user who simply needs it to work, is the gap between a celebrated demonstration and a changed life. At Ford, I demanded simplicity that was not natural to me or to the engineers around me. We were technically capable of more sophistication than we built into the Model T. We understood more about what was possible than what we put into that vehicle. The restraint was deliberate. The decision to build less than we were capable of building, so that the result would be within reach of more people, was the hardest kind of discipline to maintain in a room full of engineers who could see clearly what more capability would look like and were excited by the vision of it. But the discipline of designing for the person who needs it most, rather than for the person who can appreciate it most, is the core discipline of nation building. And every time we held to that discipline in the development of the Model T, the vehicle became more useful to more people. And every time I let the engineering enthusiasm of the men around me push the design toward what they found impressive, rather than what the farmer needed, we had to pull it back. Here is the practical version of this for your work. Whatever you are building, identify the least sophisticated person who genuinely needs what you are building, not the most sophisticated, the least. Design for them, not by reducing the ambition of what you are building, by removing every element of the design that serves the sophisticated observer rather than the ordinary user. Every feature that exists to be admired rather than to be used. Every specification that was chosen to impress rather than to serve. This discipline, applied consistently, is what produces nation-building results from building work. Not reduced ambition, redirected ambition, pointed at the user with the real need rather than at the observer with the capable appreciation. I want to address the specific question of scale here, because it is the part of the nation-building framework that people find most counterintuitive when they first encounter it. Most talented people, when they think about ambition, think about the sophistication of what they are building, more advanced technology, more complex capability, more impressive demonstration of what is possible at the frontier of the field. This is the natural direction of ambitious thinking. It feels like building up. Building toward the more complex and more capable, which feels like progress. Nation building is not the opposite of this. It is orthogonal to it. Nation building is not about building less sophisticated things. It is about building things that reach more people. The direction of the ambition is different. Instead of building deeper into complexity, it builds outward into reach. Instead of advancing what the most capable user can experience, it advances what the most ordinary user can access. These are genuinely different directions. A man who is building deeper into complexity and a man who is building outward into reach are making different decisions at almost every choice point. The deeper into complexity builder chooses the more advanced technology. The outward into reach builder chooses the more reliable technology. The deeper builder designs for the user who can understand the most sophisticated version. The outward builder designs for the user who has never encountered any version. The deeper builder measures success by the reaction of the experts. The outward builder measures success by the number of ordinary people who are using it and finding it works. Neither direction is wrong in an absolute sense. Both produce real value. Advanced capability at the frontier of a field matters and is necessary. But the specific claim of the nation builder is that reach, at sufficient scale, produces more aggregate change in human life than sophistication does. A thing that 5 million ordinary people use changes more lives than a thing that 500 sophisticated people admire, even if the admired thing is many times more technically impressive than the used thing. This was the core of my disagreement with the prevailing direction of the automobile industry in the years when I was developing the Model T. The prevailing direction was deeper into sophistication, more speed, more mechanical refinement, more elegance of design. I was pushing in a different direction. More reach, lower price, simpler maintenance, wider access. These felt like they were working against each other because the conventional wisdom was that the way to build a better automobile was to make it more sophisticated. My conviction was that the way to build a better industry was to make it more accessible. And accessible required making decisions that looked like retreating from sophistication rather than advancing. What I built was not a retreat from sophistication. It was a redeployment of sophistication toward a different goal. The assembly line that produced the Model T was one of the most sophisticated manufacturing systems in the world at the time it was operating. The engineering of the production was more advanced than the engineering of any of the vehicle designs that were aimed at wealthy buyers. But the sophistication was invisible because it was aimed at efficiency rather than at impressiveness. It produced a low price rather than an impressive demonstration. And a low price feels like the absence of sophistication to anyone who defines sophistication as what they can see and admire. Build the invisible sophistication. Build the engineering that produces lower cost, wider reach, more reliable function. Build the thing that disappears into ordinary life because it works so well that no one needs to think about it. This is harder to sustain than building the visible sophistication because visible sophistication produces immediate appreciation and invisible sophistication produces slow results that are hard to attribute to the specific choices that created them. But it is this invisible sophistication, multiplied across the millions of ordinary lives it reaches, that builds nations rather than audiences. Now I want to speak about time. Because nation building and crowd building exist in different time scales, and the difference in time scale is one of the most practically relevant differences for anyone deciding which kind of building to invest their life in. Crowd building operates in the time scale of attention. Attention has a natural cycle. It arrives at something, it peaks, it disperses as something else competes for it. The crowd builder must produce results within the attention cycle, or the results will arrive into a silence that no longer notices them. This produces a specific urgency in crowd building that is real and appropriate to its context. The spectacular demonstration must happen while the crowd is watching. The impressive result must arrive while the audience is engaged. The announcement must be made at the peak of attention rather than when the work is finally ready. Nation building operates in the time scale of need. Need does not have an attention cycle. The farmer needs to get to town whether or not anyone is paying attention to the transportation problem. The worker needs a wage sufficient to sustain his household, whether or not that problem is currently receiving public focus. The family needs affordable goods, whether or not the economy is the subject of current discussion. Need is continuous and persistent and indifferent to the attention cycle. This means that the nation builder can work at the pace that the work requires rather than at the pace that the audience's attention demands. This sounds like a relief. In practice, it is its own kind of difficulty, because working at the pace the work requires, without the urgency of an audience's attention to create pressure and accountability, requires self-generated discipline that the crowd builder's work naturally provides externally. The crowd creates urgency. The nation does not applaud until long after the work is done, if it applauds at all. The nation builder must sustain the discipline of progress without the external pressure of a watching audience to maintain it. I built in long time scales. The development of the Model T and the production systems that made it affordable took years that were largely invisible to anyone outside the company. The development of River Rouge, the full integration of production from raw material to finished vehicle, took more than a decade of steady work that received occasional notice, but no sustained public attention. The decisions that compounded into the transformation of American working life, the wage structures and production efficiencies that built purchasing power across the working population, accumulated over years without producing the kind of dramatic moment that crowds gather for. But the cumulative result of those long-scale decisions was the transformation of American life in ways that no amount of crowd-facing work could have produced. The sustained, unglamorous, patient work of building infrastructure for ordinary people at massive scale is what changes nations. The dramatic demonstration changes the narrative. The patient infrastructure changes the life. Pick your timescale deliberately. If you are building for the timescale of attention, understand clearly what that means for the kind of results you will produce. If you are building for the timescale of need, understand clearly what kind of discipline that requires and whether you have the capacity to sustain it without the external pressure of an audience's expectations. Both are legitimate choices. Neither is automatically superior, but they are genuinely different choices that produce genuinely different outcomes. And making the choice without understanding the difference is how talented people end up in the wrong building project for what they actually wanted to accomplish. Let me close with the most practical version of everything I have described, condensed into the decisions you need to make this week about what you are building. The nation builder's question for every significant decision is, does this make the thing more useful to more ordinary people, or does it make the thing more impressive to the audience that is already paying attention? These are often different options and they point in different directions. The nation-building choice is consistently the one that expands reach rather than deepens sophistication, that serves the ordinary user rather than impresses the sophisticated observer, that produces invisible results rather than visible ones. This discipline, applied over the years of building something serious, produces the specific compounding that infrastructure produces. Each decision that expands reach enables the next decision to expand it further. Each improvement in reliability enables wider adoption. Each reduction in the barrier to use enables more people to use it. The compounding is slow at first and then sudden, as the scale of adoption reaches the point where the thing being built has become infrastructure rather than a product. The two exercises I gave you earlier, the test of who benefits and how large that group is growing, and the honest audit of whether your last 5 major decisions were driven by visibility or usefulness, are the practical tools for this. Apply them weekly, not as a judgment of past decisions, as a calibration of future ones. The world has never lacked for impressive things to look at. What it consistently needs more of is useful things that reach ordinary people at the scale of their actual numbers. Build for that. Build at the scale of the nation, rather than the scale of the audience. Build the road rather than the race. And measure what you have built by the number of people whose lives are concretely better because of it, not by the number of people who found it impressive. That is what I built, and it is still running. The specific era I want to name precisely, because naming it precisely is how you avoid making it, is what I call the demonstration trap. The demonstration trap is the condition a builder falls into when the demonstration of capability becomes more important than the deployment of capability. A demonstration is impressive. It shows what is possible. It changes what observers believe can be done. It produces attention and generates conversation and advances the cultural understanding of what the limits of the field actually are. Demonstrations have real value. They are not nothing, but they are not deployment. Deployment is the unglamorous work of getting the capability into the hands of the people who need it, at the price they can afford, in the form they can actually use, at the scale of their actual numbers. Deployment is what changes lives. Demonstration is what changes minds about what is possible. Both matter. But they are different activities requiring different decisions, and the builder who confuses one for the other will produce impressive demonstrations that reach very few people rather than useful deployments that reach very many. I spent years on deployment when I could have been spending years on demonstration. The engineering I was capable of was more impressive than the engineering I built into the Model T. I chose deployment deliberately and at cost to my reputation among the people who would have been most impressed by the demonstration. I chose to be seen as building less than I was capable of building, so that more people could actually use what I was building. That choice was the most important strategic decision of my building career. And it is available to you in your own work, in whatever form the distinction between demonstration and deployment takes in your specific domain. Ask yourself today which of those two activities is receiving most of your effort. If it is demonstration, ask what it would take to shift toward deployment without abandoning the capability that the demonstration represents. The answer usually involves simplifying, lowering cost, removing barriers to use, and accepting a result that is less impressive to sophisticated observers, in exchange for one that is more accessible to ordinary users. These feel like losses to the part of you that wants to be recognized for the full extent of your capability. They are gains to the part of you that wants to actually change the most lives. Build the deployment. Do the demonstration only when it genuinely advances the deployment. And measure the success of everything you build by how many ordinary people are using it and finding it works, not by how many sophisticated observers have acknowledged how impressive it is. That is the full measure of what I built. It was not always impressive to look at while I was building it. The assembly line was boring to watch. The black paint decision was aesthetically limiting. The single model approach was commercially constrictive in ways that made investors nervous. The $5 wage was economically alarming to everyone who was not doing the full math. Every nation-building decision I made looked, from the outside and in the moment, like a constraint on what I was building, and every one of them, in the long account, was an expansion of what I was actually trying to accomplish. Build for the nation. Choose reach over sophistication. Choose useful over impressive. Choose the time scale of need over the time scale of attention. And measure what you have built, in the end, by the quiet fact of how many lives are concretely different because of it. Listen to this again tomorrow. Come back every day until the discipline described in it is your default rather than your deliberate choice. That is when you have become a nation builder. I want to speak about what it costs personally to commit to nation building over crowd building, because anyone who tells you that cost is small has not done it seriously. When you build for a nation, you spend years without the feedback that tells a crowd builder they are on the right track. The crowd builder's audience tells them daily, loudly, whether what they are producing is valued. The approval or disapproval is immediate and expressive. Even negative response is a form of engagement that confirms the building is producing something that the audience notices and cares about. The crowd builder is never in doubt about whether people are paying attention. The question is only whether the attention is favorable. The nation builder operates without this feedback for most of the building period. The farmer who bought a Model T did not write me letters about how the vehicle had changed his life. He drove it. The worker whose $5 wage had allowed his family to save for the first time did not organize a celebration in my honor. He saved. The family whose life was changed by the availability of affordable transportation did not attribute the change to any specific decision I made in the development of the production system. They simply experienced a different life than they would have experienced without it. The change was real. The attribution was invisible. This invisibility is not a small cost. Human beings are social animals. We calibrate our sense of whether we are doing the right thing partly by the response of other people to what we are doing. A builder who receives no response is a builder who has to sustain conviction about the rightness of the direction from internal resources alone, without external confirmation, for years at a time. This is genuinely difficult. I found it genuinely difficult. The periods in my building career when I was most tempted to shift toward crowd-facing work were the periods when the internal feedback from the building was richest, but the external feedback was most absent. When I knew things were going well from the inside, but could not see any evidence of it from the outside. I managed those periods by keeping close to the specific results, not the aggregate results, which were slow to accumulate and hard to measure in real time. The specific results. The specific farmer who drove a specific Model T to a specific town and did something he could not have done without it. The specific worker whose specific wage allowed his specific family to live in a specific way that would not have been possible before. Keeping close to specific results, real and named and concrete, is what sustained the conviction through the periods of invisible progress. You cannot sustain a nation-building commitment on abstraction. You have to know the specific people whose specific lives are specifically different because of what you are building. This is the practice I recommend to anyone who is building for a nation rather than for a crowd. Find the specific people. Know them by name if you can. Understand specifically what their life is like with what you have built versus what it would be without it. Keep that specific picture in front of you during the periods when the building is producing no visible result and the crowd builders around you are receiving the attention and recognition that visible results produce. The specific picture of specific improvement in specific lives is the most powerful source of conviction available to a nation builder. Nothing else sustains the discipline through the long, invisible periods, the way that specific, concrete, named improvement does. There is one more thing I want to say about the distinction between building for nations and building for crowds, and it is the most important thing. It is about what you want to have built when you look back from the end of a working life. A crowd builder, at the end of a successful career, has built things that many people found impressive. He has won competitions, set records, received recognition, produced demonstrations that changed what people thought was possible. He has a legacy of attention. People remember his name because it was attached to impressive things that received impressive coverage in their time. A nation builder at the end of a successful career has built things that many people used. He has changed the daily texture of ordinary lives in ways that are largely unattributed to him personally. He has produced infrastructure that other people used to build things he never imagined. He has a legacy of function. People use what he built without knowing or needing to know his name. Both of these are real legacies. Both represent real achievement. But only one of them grows after the builder stops. The crowd builder's legacy peaks at the moment of maximum attention and then diminishes with time as the crowd's attention moves to the next impressive thing. The nation builder's legacy grows after the builder stops, because the infrastructure continues to be used, and to enable more things, and to serve more people long after the builder is no longer present to direct it. I will say plainly that I wanted a growing legacy rather than a peaking one. I wanted to build something that would still be running, and still be serving, and still be enabling when I was no longer able to direct it. That desire shaped every major decision of my building career, not perfectly, not without deviation, and not without regret for the deviations, but consistently enough that the things I built became infrastructure rather than demonstrations. Choose the legacy you want to leave, then build backward from it. If you want the legacy of attention, build for crowds. If you want the legacy of function, build for nations. Both are available. Neither is handed to you. Both require the same quality of sustained effort and serious commitment. The difference is only in the direction that effort is pointed and the target the commitment is aimed at. Build for the nation, and when you have built something, measure it by this. Is it still running? Is it still serving? Is it still enabling people who never heard of you to do things they could not do without it? If yes, you built something real. If no, you built something impressive. Both are real achievements. Only one is a nation. Subscribe and come back for what's next.